Hey guys, Stealth here. This video is part of a series of videos that I'll be releasing on how to play Steel Division. This series is oriented towards people who have never played Steel Division before, nor Wargame Red Dragon or any of the other Wargame titles. Being familiar with other RTSs will help, but it's no prerequisite. In this video we're going to be looking at the battle group overview and specifically the unit categories that you have. Now, one of the most important things to realize is that every single battle group orients itself around a different area. For example, this is the 2nd Infantry battle group, also known as Indian Head. And as you can see, this battle group has a lot of cards, or little icons as we call them here, cards, in the Infantry tab, because it is a deck that focuses on infantry. As such, this is going to be your most important unit category. Other decks, such as an armored deck, will be focusing much more around armored units and might not have as many infantry units or as many options in the infantry tab. So what you need to know first is that every single deck has a particular strong suit. Orient your deck around that. Orient your deck around that specific unit category. Now, let's start from the top to the bottom. We have, for starters, Reconnaissance. These, you could argue, are the most important units in your deck. These are the units in your army that will give you information on where the enemy is, what the front line is doing, where you should be reinforcing, where you might be able to push into the enemy lines, and where the enemy might be potentially able to push into yours. These guys provide the information. And as per the deck system, you have several different categories. You have the reconnaissance units that are sheerly oriented towards scouting and not doing anything else, such as the scouts that you see here. They're a very small group, only 4 guys. Very good stealth, means that they're very easy to hide and not that easy to detect by the enemy. Their optics is very high, and this means that they will be able to scout quite a bit. Compare this to, for example, reconnaissance from other categories, and you see that their optics is normal. And for tanks, it's usually just very low. Tanks are basically blind. So reconnaissance will help you with scouting out the enemy and keeping an eye on what the enemy is doing. And there are several different units, as I mentioned. You have the basic sheer recon units that don't do any fighting. These are the scouts. You drop them off, you put them in a position where they can spot, and they basically sit there for most of the match, unless the front line shifts either towards them, in which case you might want to withdraw, or if the front line shifts away from them, in which case their previous position is going to be less handy, simply because they can't see anything anymore. Now you also have groups which are slightly more oriented towards fighting. Let me pull up another deck. UK 6th Airborne has scout groups such as these. These are the AB Scouts, very similar to the ones that I just indicated. They are mostly there as spotters. But these guys, if they are pushed, can push back. They are very capable of, for example, dealing with armored units using their Gammon bombs. You also have Pathfinders in this deck, and these are what you call offensively oriented recon units. They can go on the offensive. They have anti-infantry weapons, anti-tank weapons, and these guys even come with smoke grenades. So keep an eye on what kind of unit you're looking at and what kind of combat role they might fit. As a rule of thumb, when you're looking at units that you might want to have as passive spotters, use cheap units. So going back to my US armor deck, these scouts are only 25 points. And that makes them very nice, very cheap, very easy to deploy, and if you lose them, well, unfortunate, but so be it. You can basically afford to lose them. Whereas more expensive recon units tend to be more of a pain to lose. Now these are the slow scouts. You also have faster scouts, such as the M8 Greyhound. Very fast at 30 kph off-road and 95 km per hour on-road. The problem that these things have is that they have bad stealth. The good side is that they have ammo and all sorts of of course they carry ammo, that they have all sorts of different ammunitions. These guys have a 37mm gun, a 7.62mm gun, and a 12.7mm gun. So these guys are much better at killing off enemy vehicles and enemy infantry units than any of the other recon categories. Now, to make matters worse for recon, you also have some reconnaissance units in the air tab. These units are, for example, the Grasshopper. You can always identify them by the binoculars icon. That's on top left of the unit card. This says it's a reconnaissance unit. It is most of the time unarmed, very slow. They have very high optics, and they will only fly around the map looking for trouble, basically. Scouting out an area where you point them to. And they will do nothing but that. They're not there to attack something. The exception, you could say, is the Rosie in this deck. It has a couple of bazooka missiles. Very, very inaccurate. Accuracy goes on a scale of 1 to 10, and these guys are extremely inaccurate. And therefore, if you're looking for a scout plane, I would always go with the Grasshopper over the Rosie. But that's very deck specific. Next tab, the Infantry. Now, Infantry is a category that is very handy when you have cover for them. Infantry does not do very well out in the open. Whereas if you have infantry inside a building, they are much safer. And especially if you're doing town-to-town fighting, so you have one unit of your own inside one building block, and the enemy has one infantry unit of their own in another block, then you're going to be fighting it out that way. If the enemy infantry is out in the open, they will take suppression damage. And suppression damage means that they are much faster going to be lessening their effect on the battlefield. They're going to start panicking, basically. And the more panicked they get, at some point they will be forced to retreat. Now again, you have these in several different categories. For example, these guys are the standard rifle troop. They are not anything special. They come with 2 M1 carbines, or carabinos. They come with 8 M1 Garands, and that's it. At least for the anti-infantry division. You also have the bazookas, so these guys can deal with enemy transports and tanks. Then you have the leader infantry, and you have these leader stars in various different categories. Now the leaders are there mostly to boost the morale and the veterancy level of units around them. So you can see that these guys have no star icons above them. Some of them do, especially later on, and especially in the tank tab, because this is a tank deck, focuses around tanks and gives more veterancy stars to tanks. These veterancy stars will make your units less likely to panic, less likely to run away from the fight, and boost accuracy, rate of fire, etc. They basically boost all the stats of the units that they're around. They themselves are usually not particularly good combat units, especially not in the infantry tab, because this leader group is only a 4-man strength. It is going to go down very, very quickly, and therefore is not a frontline unit. They are there to follow up slightly behind the front line, making sure that the units who are on the front line, and in this deck that could be the rifles, are there to hold on to their firm belief and their confidence that they can win the battle. You also have engineers. Engineers are a different category. They usually carry a specialty item, such as in this case, frag. This is a TNT explosive device. It has a very high explosive value of 22, but its range is very low. And this means that while it will be very effective against infantry, you have to get very close to do so. You also have HMGs, or machine guns in general. These are usually smaller groups, 4-man group in this case, carrying a 7.62mm gun, but this can basically be any sort of machine gun. They are not there to kill off enemy infantry most of the time. They are there to suppress enemy infantry, make sure that they cannot move up, or that they're going to start panicking. They are usually not the folks that you use to kill off the enemy infantry. That's what the frontline infantry, such as the rifle groups, are for. Now, if I were to go into every single type of infantry and all sorts of different units that you have in all the different decks, then this would be a video that would last for about 3 hours. So that's going to be saved up for several different deck reviews. Another important element in the infantry tab is the transport that you pick for them. You can see that as I'm hovering over a unit, you can see this is, for example, the ARM leader, so the armed leader. Then you also have the M3A1HT, it says down there in the bottom. This is the transport that they come with, and depending on the transport, a unit can be more expensive or more cheap. For example, I can bring in, let's say, the leaders. Can I bring these in different transports? Yeah, not really the right example. Some of these transports are cheap transports, basically a drop-off truck. They will vanish the moment that the infantry has been delivered. These guys, for example, make up one of those transports, the CMP. They are not armed, they are just there to bring the infantry to the front line. Once you disembark them, they vanish. Other units, not so much. And the US armor group that I have here, the M3HT is armed. As a rule of thumb, if a unit is armed, a transport unit, it will stay in the battle. And it will lay down suppressive fire and help the infantry group that it was transporting. These guys can be remarkably powerful. So be aware of the unit of transport that you pick. Now let's move on to the tank tab. And yes, there is way more to talk about in this infantry section, but I want to keep this unit, or I want to keep this video focused around the different unit categories. The tanks, these guys are there for much more open conflict. You do not drive a tank into a town, because there's a very high risk that you're running into an anti-tank weapon fired at short range by the infantry, and you lose your tank. Now, as you can see by the price tags here, 90, 90, 130, and it goes all the way up to 200 for this deck, tanks are usually a bigger investment. This is because they are, well, depending on the situation that they find themselves in, more versatile. They can deal with different sorts of threats, they are more durable than infantry units, and usually they are a pretty important element in your deck to do a push. Now, all decks are different, and all decks have different choices for their tanks. The US Armor Division, for example, relies on bringing out more tanks. As you can see, especially later on in the phases, in Phase B I can bring out 5 tanks per card. So if I have 1 card, this will allow me to bring in 5 of these units in a battle. And other decks will focus around quality, not quantity. For example, the Axis, these guys have some really expensive tanks. The Panther G, 280 points, but it is much less available than the other units. And the same goes for the type of tank that you're using. Usually you have basically 2 different variations here. You have the standard run-of-the-mill tank. These guys are there to make up the bulk of your tank forces. Then you have these command tanks. They are armed exactly the same way and usually the same armor layout as their standard variant, such as the M5A1. But the command M5A1 is there to bring out the veterancy and make sure that these guys don't panic, gain a bit of rate of fire, gain a bit of accuracy, and all that will help them to do better on the battlefield. And the same you can see here for the command M4A1 versus the M4A1. It's the same type of tank. It is just there to bring out the veterancy. Now the tanks, lots and lots to talk about here. I'm not going to go into too much detail, as this is an overview of the unit categories, not the units themselves so much. Tanks are not solo operators. They are never to be sent out on the front line alone, because they are very poor at spotting enemy units. Their optics are very low, which means that they're not that likely to spot stuff on their own. You will always need to accompany them with a reconnaissance unit for spotting, potential infantry support depending on the type of terrain, maybe some anti-air, and potentially artillery, slightly further behind these units. These are not solo warriors. They can be there to back up your infantry, or you can have your infantry back up the tank. And this is basically one of the heavy damage dealer categories of your deck. The infantry and the tank tabs. These are the ones that really do the damage. Then you have the support tab. Now, as the tab already indicates, this deck, or this section here, is dedicated towards supporting all the other units. Which means that the units in here are capable on themselves. You could send them out on their own if you absolutely had to, but it's not recommended. They are there to function as a sort of synergy with other units. Such as, you can have a infantry unit move out with, for example, the armed rifles. And these guys, for example, have lost their transport, which means that their only means of firepower is their own weaponry, which is short-ranged. 200 meters, 300 meters, and 200 meters for the bazooka. So they're not that good at laying down suppressive fire at anything greater than 300 meters. That is where this Jeep with a 50 cal machine gun might come in handy. These guys can jump to an opportunity very quickly, suppress enemy infantry so that your own infantry can move up. Now in this situation the armed rifles do come with the M3 HT, which is perfectly capable of laying down suppressive fire all by themselves. So in this case it might not be required. But what happens if your tank comes up against enemy infantry? Well, it does carry HE rounds, which are there to kill off enemy infantry. But other than that, they only have machine guns. And you could say, well, I could just bring a second tank if there's a lot of infantry threatening my tank. Yes, you could, but tanks are expensive. If I were to bring in a second M4A375, that would cost me 160 points. If one tank was enough to hold the front line, and if this one was pushing into infantry, this is where, for example, the 50 cal Jeep could come in handy, or the M8 Scott. The M8 Scott, when compared to this unit, has a far higher HE gun than the one on the M4A3. So you can see the 75mm gun on the Sherman there, the M4A3, only does 5 points of HE power every time it hits. The M8 Scott has a 75mm gun, but it fires slightly different ammunitions, and these things do 9 HE damage. They also carry a very nice assortment of them, and they even have a splash radius. You can see that there in the last category where it says AOE, Area of Effect. So if you're dealing with units that, for example, are infantry heavy, the M8 Scott might be a very worthy, handy assistant to your tank. There are all sorts of various categories in here as well. You have units that provide command stars, such as the M20 Command. You have the flamethrower troops, very handy to support your infantry in dealing with other infantry at short range. You have the GMCs. These are logistics units. As you can see here, they are supply units and they carry supplies, especially ammunition, to friendly units. These can resupply, for example, your infantry, your AA, your anti-tank, your tanks, anything that might need ammo. What they do not do is repair your units, provide reinforcements to your infantry groups, and this is, especially if you're coming from Wargame, a very drastic difference. They can only be used to resupply and to transport other units. That's it. Next up, anti-tank. Anti-tank category is there to, as the tank, or as the anti-tank tab means, to kill off enemy tank units or enemy armored units. It doesn't really focus solely on tanks, because if the enemy is coming at you with a whole horde of infantry transports, then these guys can be effective against them just as much. Now there are basically 3 categories of anti-tank units. One is this type, the M1 gun, the M5 gun, the 88. These are slower, more static defensive units. They are not particularly good at moving up with an attack. As you can see, their speed, once they have been deployed, that is only 10 kilometers per hour. These guys are very, very slow. Now they're being dragged into the battlefield by the M3 HT, which is fast, but once you unhook these things from the M3, they are there to be moved by these 2 guys that you see here. There is nothing else that can move these things, nor can you reattach them to their transport and make sure that they move out at a much faster pace. That's one category. Then you have units which are infantry. These are short-ranged, anti-armored units, or anti-armor or anti-tank, depending on how you want to call them. Usually very short range. They only have a 200-meter range. Now, as you can see, they don't have a very clear AP value. It only says anti-tank weapon. And this thing, mounted on infantry or carried by infantry, is so powerful that it will usually cut through any armor that it may deal with. No matter if it's a very, very lightly armored tank or a very heavily armored unit. It doesn't matter. If you can get these guys into range, they will kill them. The last category is faster mobile anti-tank units. Let me find one. The TD-M10A1 is a good example. This is an anti-tank unit that is not there to be sitting quietly inside the bushes. It's not there to take out units at short range. It's there to take out units in the field. Whereas, for example, your tank might not have the amount of firepower required. These tank destroyers can usually do it. Now they're usually mobile, 25 kilometers per hour off-road, 70 kph on-road. Stealth usually not very good, whereas these guys still have medium stealth, which means that they are decent at doing ambushing. And same goes, of course, for your infantry troopers here. They are usually not units that you attack with, at least not on their own. Just as the tank, they need support. They need some sort of screening around them to make sure they're not instantly going to get wiped out. Anti-air. These anti-air units are not particularly there to kill off enemy air units. It may sound weird, but the goal is not always to kill the enemy air unit. The goal is to scare off the enemy airplane and make sure that it doesn't come after your forces. This is primarily the role of anti-air. And of course, yes, you can shoot them down, but the more reliable way of killing off an enemy aircraft is by using air power. Now there are basically two distinctions between the AA. It's either fast firing low caliber or slow firing high caliber. The difference is in their role. This, for example, is the DCA M16. It carries a 12.7mm gun, 4 of them, as you can, it carries 4 of these. It's a quad setup. The rate of fire is very, very high. Their range at 800 meters is decent, and they carry, they do 16 HE damage. If you're dealing with larger groups of aircraft or multiple aircraft, then these guys can be very handy. But their usefulness at range quickly cuts off. This is where they differ, for example, from the Bofor. The Bofor has a 40mm gun, thereby much bigger. Their rate of fire is not 1600 but only 92 rounds a minute. Their range is increased, their HE damage is increased. Correction, their HE damage is actually less. This is, by the way, reflected by the fact that the M16 is a quad stack of guns and the Bofors is only a single one. And they even have an area of effect of 11 meters. If you're dealing with a larger area where you want to have fewer AA guns, then the Bofors might be a better pick. Now these Bofors are pretty fast. They are mounted on a chassis, so these guys can still move around quickly. The other Bofors, such as these, don't. You ferry them to their transport, to their destination using the GMC. Once you offload them or unload them, these GMC transports will disappear and you're left with the Bofors, which can then only move at 10 kilometers per hour, which is really, really slow. So make sure that you get your unit to where it needs to go before you press that unload button. Now there are also German guns, and the German guns are usually very, very big and very powerful, but also very expensive. This is the Flak 41 88mm. These things cost you 140 points. That's 135 for the gun and 5 for the transport. Now this transport is armed, so it will stay in the area after it has offloaded the Flak 41. Flak 41 has a very high range, but a very low rate of fire. And these guys are better at dealing with single aircraft. So you're shooting at, for example, one aircraft and they can almost stun or panic a unit and force it to withdraw with one shot. But they are not that good at dealing with larger groups of aircraft. If you're dealing with 4 or 5 units of aircraft at a time, which in a 10v10 match is possible, then these guys, the Flak 36, 37, might be more efficient because they fire faster and can divide their firepower over several different A units. Next unit is artillery. Now this category is there to provide either direct or most of the time, indirect support for your units. There are several different units that you can field here. In this German case, you have mortar carriers. These guys are mobile mortar units. Some decks rely on mortars which are carried by infantry, making them much slower, but also much more cheap, because they are not to be armored, and this will save you quite a few points in the price tag there. Now, these units, the SDKFZ 250/7, can not only deploy HE rounds, but it can also deploy smoke rounds. And this is going to be a very important element of these units as you're either pushing or withdrawing. But I'm not going to go into smoke screens too heavily at the moment. Smoke screens are basically there to either help you push into an area where you want the enemy to be blind, or you want to blind the enemy so your forces can withdraw. So these units would be helpful in a position where you're either withdrawing from an enemy attack or deploying smoke so you can move forward. Not all units can deploy smoke. Some units can only deploy straight up firepower, such as this unit, the Panzerwerfer. Some of these are also carrying napalm explosive devices or napalm units. And these units can usually be separated by, let's see, where's the napalm tag? Are the Fallschirmjägers carrying these? I cannot quite find one at the moment. Anyway, here is the small mortar infantry group. As you can see, where the German unit cost me 80 points, or 85 even, these units only cost me 40 points. Their range is lower. They carry more rounds, but it does less HE damage. They carry more smoke rounds, but they're more vulnerable. They're only a 3-man group. They can be very easily suppressed, very easily killed off, and if they do, then you could argue, well, it's no big deal, because they only lost 3 guys. And then there is a final category, this one. This is what we call an artillery observer. And you can see that the unit itself is nothing special. This is just a Kubel transport, or a Kubel jeep. It just doesn't do anything on its own. Its main ammo, or its main armament, is its radio, because these things are capable of, with their radio, calling in off-map support from, in this case, the railroad battery. This is a 380mm gun that is mounted on a train, and the train is supposed to be off-map. You will never see this gun fire. You will only see the effects of this gun. If you fire this one, you need to be able to observe or spot the firing range. So where do you want to fire? That's what you want to be seeing. And making sure that this unit happens to be on the front line would be helpful. But don't get it too far on the front line or you'll find it getting killed off. So be careful there. And as with these units, as with most of the caliber guns, or the caliber of the guns, the bigger the gun, the lower the rate of fire. Compare the 50mm grenade launcher or the 50mm mortar to, for example, this 122mm gun. Rate of fire is 15 or 4. The bigger the caliber of the gun, the lower the rate of fire. So you always want to make sure that you know exactly what kind of unit you're bringing in and what role you indicate for that unit. Comparing, let's see, these guys cannot deploy smoke. Yeah, these guys can deploy smoke. If I want to deploy a fast smoke screen, I would use the 50mm gun, because this one can deploy smoke at a rate of 15 rounds a minute, whereas the 120mm mortar would be able to lay smoke as well, but only at an 8 round a minute rate of fire. So artillery is going to get its whole separate video sometime later. At least now you know what these different units are and what they can do. And finally we have air. The air tab is where you bring in your aircraft. Now these guys are not stationed anywhere on the map. They're stationed off map. Once you call these guys in, they are coming in from off of the map and doing their bidding and then flying back to their airfield, again off map, to rearm, repair and resupply. There are several different categories of aircraft. One is the recon plane. I already briefly mentioned this one. This is there to just observe the enemy. Usually unarmed, very slow at 175 kilometers per hour. It just circles across the battlefield and does nothing. But they're pretty easy to shoot down. So make sure that especially later on in the match you don't use these things anymore, because you will find them going down pretty quickly. Then we have the Me-109G2, and this is an anti-tank rocket. Now this is a debatable term. These things carry two 210mm rockets, and this varies from deck to deck and nation to nation. These units are supposed to be effective against tanks. The thing is, they just aren't always effective against tanks. Sometimes they're going to just stun the tank, sometimes you're going to find them very effective against transports, and you can even use them against infantry if you want to. These guys can be used against infantry as well. They're just rocket planes, making them usually pretty accurate. Really depends on their state of mind. If they're panicked, they're going to be less accurate. But most of the time, very nice for a quick strike on a single target, not an area of effect weapon. Next category is the fighter. Just your straight up dogfighting unit. It's there to kill off enemy aircraft, and that's the whole of it. That's all that these things are here for. You can see that some of these come with a star, meaning experience, and this one is a Fallschirmjäger deck, which means it's an airborne deck, and thereby I can have some very veteran aircraft, such as the Me-109 G6. These guys come with 2 stars, are less likely to panic, and are capable of doing a lot of damage against enemy forces. Now, something that the game doesn't tell you, but that you can do with these guys, is strafe. You can just have them fly over the map, dealing with infantry as they're out in the open, and this will either suppress the infantry very quickly, or potentially wipe them out altogether. And then we come to the next category of aircraft. For example, the Focke-Wulf 190. You can see this thing has a bomber tag. If you have one bomb, it says light bomber. They carry up to 250 kilograms of bombs, usually effective against infantry. Not so much against transports, and especially not against tanks, because they simply don't have the ammunition or the firepower to deal with the armor that those units carry. You do have heavier bombers, such as this one. The Ju-88S comes with 2 500 kilogram bombs, making them more effective against units such as armored units, think transports, tanks, and especially infantry is going to start suffering once you drop a 500 kilogram bomb on top of their heads. The thing is that they're slow, 600 kilometers per hour, they have bad agility, meaning they are very poor at ducking away from enemy fighters, and this is going to balance out the fact that they can deliver a heavy blow, but that the platform, so the bomber itself, is more vulnerable. And then, basically as the last category, we have the HS-129B3. This one is a tank buster. These guys are much more capable of dealing with enemy tanks than, for example, your rocket plane, such as the one that we discussed here, the anti-tank rocket. The HS-129B3 is armed with this 75mm gun, the Bordkanone as they call it. You can see it sticking out here. This thing has 18 points of armor piercing, which means that it is very capable of dealing with enemy tanks. It carries only 13 rounds, but usually is going to fire quite a few of them at a target as they're doing a sort of strafing run. Ducking away from the target again and making sure you evac them in time will ensure that these guys stay alive. Only if you have complete air superiority, where the enemy either has no fighters and or no AA, can you safely keep these things in the area for longer periods of time. I wouldn't recommend it though, because they are still pretty damn vulnerable. So you bring these guys in only against higher value targets. Do not have these guys fly at a tank, which is only going to cost the enemy 50 or 60 points, because you'll find that it is just not worth it. Killing a 50 or 60 point unit with a 200 point plane will always risk the 200 point plane and only gives you limited results. Whereas killing a 160 point tank and potentially losing your aircraft is much better of a trade-off. Now there are all sorts of various bombers that you can bring out. Let's see, the 6th Airborne, for example, also has another category. This is the Napalm Bomber. Not particularly good against armored units, but very, very handy if you want to have the enemy infantry get out of a building, a town, or any sort of entrenched position. As these guys deploy 4 napalm bombs onto a target, meaning that the target is going to be engulfed in flames, and it's going to be a very unhappy infantry unit down there. Some units deploy multiple bombs. they are more along the lines of carpet bomber, and some units deploy several smaller, lesser or fewer but more damaging bombs, so higher category. And then there is one very special aircraft. This is the DB-7B. As States is currently, and this is slightly before the game gets released, this is the only bomber that can deploy smoke screens. Yes, this is a French bomber that can deploy smoke screens. It carries 6 bombs, and it is very capable of quickly laying a large smoke screen in front of your forces to either, as I mentioned before, attack or withdraw. These units require quite a bit of extra explanation, and if you're just getting started out with the game, I would not recommend that you pick up these units right away. They are very handy, but they are a rather precise element to use. So I would recommend that you study these units a bit more, experiment with them, and or watch another one of my videos on them, as I will be having one up very soon, if not already. So that is, in a nutshell, the 8 different categories. Things you need to remember: Recon is the eyes and ears of your deck. These are extremely important units. Infantry, very handy in comfortable situations where they can take cover. Use them inside a town, use them inside of areas for tree lines, but not so much out in the open. Tanks are to be used out in the open and not inside of tree lines, not inside of towns. They are very, very vulnerable there. Support units benefit all units that they can help out. Anti-tank units separate themselves out into ambush units, the more static defense guns, short-range infantry, and fast mobile tank destroyers. Anti-air, you get to pick between engaging several aircraft with a low-caliber fast-firing gun or a couple of targets, so let's say 1 or 2 targets with a high-caliber gun which fires a lot slower. Artillery, always indirect fire, sometimes coming off from outside the map, such as the OP or the Observer platform. Always capable of laying HE damage, sometimes laying napalm, and sometimes capable of laying smoke. And finally the air. All sorts of different aircraft that can help out your forces. Don't expect your air tab to hold out on a front line. They are not units that are there to hold the line. That's where everything else comes in. These guys are there to augment forces, kill off enemy aircraft, or allow pushes to be more effective. So that's the short of it. I hope it was useful. If it was, please give it a like so the video is going to get more views and help more people. If you have any questions, leave those down in the comments, and if you have anything to add that I haven't covered, be sure to do so in the comments down below, so long as it describes 2 unit categories, not so much specific units. Thank you for watching, hope you found it useful, and I'll see you soon for more videos.